Good morning, and we're up into the session 2 of our at-risk forum. As it should be obvious to you all by now that this is a very different kind of setup than we had yesterday. We don't get the windows and the view of the Trump Tower. I'm sure you'll all miss that. But the configuration of these rooms comes from two things. Number one, we wanted this to be a conversation among the CRL community. We are all, people here are all members or all representatives of libraries in the CRL community, as well as some invited guests. So what we are talking about is CRL's agenda for the support of shared print archival and print preservation. The CRL's agenda for long-term support going forward of the integrity and accessibility of the print corpus. So the discussions this morning are with some people we've invited who represent particularly important sectors of our community, or sectors that are particularly important to our community. People that are building that are building print repositories and have put together shared print programs. People that have built digital preservation repositories and are therefore maintaining for the long term digital content, both born digital and digitized content on behalf of our community. People that are publishing, that have been publishing in databases and in the past microfilm publications that have been of importance to our community. So those are all people that we're going to have conversations with this morning. Since we have the 2 rooms, we want things to be relatively equal. So we're going to do a shift. We're between now and 10:30 when we have a break. We'll have 2 sessions in each room. At the break, the panelists on those 2 sessions will switch rooms. So we thought that'd be easier to move 6 people than to move the 100 and some that are here. And so if you're not a panelist, you can stay put. This is a Charrette session, so it's a session where we invite participation, we invite your comments, we invite you to share your thoughts, share your questions, share your objections. And we also have a number of people that are participating online. In fact, I think we had about close to 100 people that registered to participate online. So we also invite you folks online, wherever you are, to submit your questions and comments by chat. You don't have fully the rights of citizenship that the people in these rooms have, but we hope you can participate. We'll definitely hear your voices. So that chat will come in through a machine over here that I'll be monitoring from time to time. So this afternoon we'll have the 2 rooms, but we won't have panelists switching rooms. So essentially it'll be, if you can get into the one room where we're talking, then that's the best, that's the fullest, most vivid experience of the at-risk forum. But the second room you'll have a video feed and audio feed, and you'll be able to participate in conversations there as well. So that's that with the logistics. This afternoon, what we'll be doing is 2 things. We will talk about the actions that we believe are in order and possible and feasible. We'll talk about them in fairly broad terms. We won't have a blueprint at the end of the day. We'll have the makings of a blueprint, which then will be reported to CRL libraries, CRL members after the fact. We also have, the second thing we want to have is some language, some better language to talk about what we're doing. So enable us to talk about what it is we talk about when we talk about preservation. Language that will make sense and be convincing, be credible, be defensible, not only among the library community, people in the library community, but also people depending on the library community, like the scholars, researchers, and students that we serve. So those will be the 2 parts of this afternoon session. So with that, I think that's everything. Yesterday I failed to do a number of things I was supposed to do, so I'm checking my list now to make sure that I got it all today. I want to introduce, I will let James Simon, who's Vice President for Collections and Services at the Center for Research Libraries, who will be the man with the microphone in the second room, or the room that I am not in. So if you don't see me in front of you, you should look for James Simon, looking for the discussions in that room. So with that, I'll let James take the helm there, and I'll take the helm here. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, James.
Okay.
Old school. All right. So I'm going to introduce our moderator, Martha Hruska, who is Associate University Librarian for Collections at University of California, San Diego, and a member of Center for Research Libraries Board of Directors, and Chair of the Collections and CRL Collections and Services and Policy Committee. Martha.
Okay. Good morning. I hope people can hear me wherever they are. I hope so. I know you. Okay. So you guys can. So that's good. So we wanted to take this morning to talk some about, from the perspective of major academic and independent research libraries, what do we see as the benefits and barriers to being better able to connect and work through some of the issues that we've talked about yesterday regarding looking at print retention largely. So with me today is David Magier from Princeton University. He is the, let's see, let me make sure I get it right, Associate University Librarian for Collection Development there. And Mary Miller is the Director of Collection Management and Preservation at the University of Minnesota Libraries. So let me just start briefly, but we really do want to engage in a conversation and invite lots of questions, but kind of maybe preface remarks, and David can start, and Mary, just from their perspective of being at a large private and a large public university and some of the issues they see.
Great, thank you, Martha. So I'll start and just throw out a couple of ideas that might stimulate discussion and some principles if we try to unpack what it is that major research libraries might be able to do to help support what's called the safety net. And the first principle that I want to put out there is, as was discussed yesterday repeatedly, the overlap and connection between preservation and access. Making the content is not enough, obviously, to have it. It's not enough to retain it if you don't make it accessible. So a lot of what we have to talk about in this little session is how we share and how we enable sharing. And a big piece of that, in my view, is connected to the inevitable focus on level of use. When we talk about unique and unusual serial holdings that may be held in very few libraries, we're talking about the need to invest actual resources to make them, to preserve them and make them accessible. And inevitably, no matter how nice the provost might be at a given institution, when push comes to shove, somebody's going to start counting use. And by definition, some of these unique print-only journals, they never made it to digital in a commercial world because they're relatively low use, but they're still important for research. And so how do we ensure that the biggest possible use is there to demonstrate the value for research of these materials? And that's why I think one of the things that research libraries can and must focus on with these kinds of holdings is discovery. What can we do that, and I'll give like a prototypical case study, right, just as an example. So we have at Princeton and at many of the libraries represented here, rich collections in what's called area studies, journals from different parts of the world. And many of those are fairly unique holdings. They're in other languages often, and they are often very low use. Why? Because how do you discover, let alone request, what you need from a journal? You need article level discovery. And these things might not be indexed. They're not digitized already. They're not indexed. Because you have this catch-22, because they're low use, they're often put in off-site storage. They're not even browsable. So who is ever going to find the articles in those journals in Punjabi or whatever language? And so I think we need to invest in unearthing those tables of contents in some fashion so that people know what they want, so that they can request it. Our libraries are very liberal in lending already. I mean, there aren't barriers to lending. We have something, you know what you want, we have it, we'll send it to you. It's a journal article, we'll scan it and deliver it, just like CRL does. If it's a whole volume, not every library does this, but we will send bound volumes of journals on interlibrary loan, and obviously with books. But nobody's going to request an article if they don't know it exists. So I want to just highlight this as something that can be done in a relatively low overhead fashion to create article level browsing and discovery through tables of contents online. So I'll stop there.
Okay. And we can talk about, is that a relatively low barrier? Because I think in some ways it's a great idea, but there is a question of, so where would the resources come to actually do that index scanning? Because in some ways, many of us are concerned about even the prospect of the higher level, the meta level of scanning of journals, let alone getting into the article level. And especially, and I take your point about the area study languages, but when they also present even more challenges in terms of discoverability because of the language. Is that a barrier?
Just very quickly, I'll say something to that. Of course, if we're talking about indexing, if we're talking about assigning subjects, or if we're talking about scanning with OCR, which doesn't exist for lots of languages, we have a problem. But I'm saying you don't have to go all the way in order to make incremental improvements in discovery. You can have simple page images of tables of contents. You're not doing full text scanning. You're not indexing. You're not doing OCR. You're saying, here you can browse virtually this thing that's sitting in remote storage halfway around the world in a different library. If you make that a collaborative project, if you put these page images of tables of contents in a central repository, and you sustain them with permanent URLs, you add them to the catalog records for the journals in WorldCat and elsewhere, I think you've got the makings of a framework for people to find what they want in those by browsing.
If you'd ask a question now or wait.
I think we're going to do this conversationally, so yes, I think we can take questions.
I'm Linda DiBiase from the University of Washington, and I'd be interested, David, you well know that there has been an initiative in South Asian Studies to have tables of contents, and has there been any information gathered about changes in use as a result of that?
Not to my knowledge, and it's all very new. I was actually going to show this on the screen, but I don't want to take too much time. But Washington, CRL, Princeton, University of Chicago, University of Texas, and many others, Cornell, Yale, Columbia, they're all contributing tables of contents. We have more than 1,000 such tables of contents already contributed. For South Asian language journals in our holdings, which are not indexed, not findable anywhere, and we know people are using it, but I don't know yet if it's had enough impact on requests for those articles.
And is there some plan built in to gather that information in the future? It would seem to be
It would be nice, yeah.
Evaluate that as a strategic
direction. It's a good idea. It would be a bit challenging because of the distributed nature of this, because if you're talking about requests, although the discovery is centralized through this repository of tables of contents, the requesting system would be via the interlibrary loan offices at each of the holding libraries. So aggregating the impact of this might be a little challenging. But I think among this group, as far as I'm aware, the emphasis has been on keeping it the lowest possible overhead. It doesn't rise to the digital offices in any of these libraries. It's run by students who just make PDFs of tables of contents and cram them into this online thing, and seems to be filling a need, as far as I'm concerned.
Thanks, Linda. There's actually a Latin Americanist project. Latin Americanists are doing similar things. Latin Americanist table of contents database is hosted, I think, by Vanderbilt University now. That was something done under the project under the LAM Area Studies Project program at based at CRL, and is working with a lot of engineers. So we did a analysis of whether it's working, those kinds of things working on a bundle of Latin Americanists, or they may have some data about how much that's done.
I just wanted to make a simple observation too, that I think that's a good way to begin, and to tie it to promotion of those titles, tie it back to the subject specialists, and leverage the area studies groups that exist through CRL, so that we don't have to do that article level indexing, but just by promoting those titles with those specialists, then they get out there more. We know by just digitizing things, they will get used, but I think to kind of put that person behind it as well is important.
Combination of, yeah.
So I think that's a very useful and potentially a very achievable objective, particularly if it's done collaboratively. I do think to be useful, it has to be searchable and it has to be managed and housed in such a way that it's discoverable, because just doing a page image is a step in that direction, but without OCR, it isn't much help. With our GLOC project, we make sure that we have metadata in the language of the publication on the assumption that if you can read Haitian Creole, you should be able to search in Haitian Creole, and it may in fact be easier for you to search in Haitian Creole. But we also make sure that we have English language metadata for every item in GLOC, so that there's some consistency and perhaps opportunity for someone to use using Haitian Creole, for example, again, may be limited, and yet we still want them to be able to discover the item and potentially have it translated if they need to. So it would seem to me we would also need to consider not just scanning and OCRing, but perhaps translation in order to help with that discoverability. And that makes it a bigger and more costly project, but also potentially a useful project.
And the DLOC is the Digital Library of the Caribbean. It's a large, very important digital library hosted by the University of Florida.
I'll just say I agree with you that we can all picture that ideal in which this low-use material is fully exposed, full text. Why not? If we can. Metadata, translation, annotation, subject assignment, full-fledged work of the kind you would find in a commercial database. The problem is that that's, as you said, expensive, and I don't know how scalable it is if we're talking about exposing every article in every one of these journals. It's really hard, but I don't say that we couldn't ever get there. I'm saying we need a first step so people even know these journals exist, and they, by browsing through the tables of contents, they at least can find some things that might fit their needs.
So as a first step, maybe having and engaging the area specialists who can take the first pass at making a suggestion about what are the significant journals that really should be exposed, so that you can then start to have a situation where these are discoverable at a certain level, and then and then you can use demand as sort of drive where you do need to pay maybe more attention. And so again, I think our whole conversation today will be this balance between what is a barrier or an opportunity, and the opportunity is certainly being defined in such a way that they are positive because they might be things we could do collectively rather than what each individual library could do on its own. I want to maybe ask Mary to say a few words. I know she was engaged in doing a survey for, if I get it right, ARL and the Oberlin libraries about their retention policies and how they might relate to making statements about condition, but then, and that gets at one of the questions I think we want to ask about how willing are libraries in general, and how, enabled are they to disclose that kind of information?
Thanks, Martha. And I'll just warn you, I've been prone to fits of coughing the last couple of days, so bear with me. So just to give you a little bit of background about my institution, the University of Minnesota is a publicly funded land-grant institution that's also the only Tier 1 research library in the state. We're also right next door to Minitex, which is a resource sharing program that does ILL and document delivery for all of the libraries in the state as well as the Dakotas. So in terms of library of record, we definitely consider ourselves to be that, however you define it. I think that I was also asked to be here because of a survey that I've been, that I worked on with a group of preservation administrators this past summer from large ARL institutions, University of Illinois, University of Pennsylvania, Yale, and Northwestern. The survey originated from a discussion with a large group of preservation administrators where we started talking about the fact that across the country, serials and now monographs are being withdrawn for various reasons. And it's based on the assumption that there are other copies out there, but without a lot of actual knowledge about how many copies there are out there and what the condition of those copies are. And as preservation administrators, we're obsessed with condition for many reasons. But as we all know, I mean, we can make some assumptions about condition based on the age and other issues, but there's a lot of variation in how materials might be in terms of their state, depending on the use of that institution, but also the climate conditions they've been in. So one of the things we wanted to try to understand is how does condition and other factors like that come into play in terms of how institutions make decisions about what they retain and what they withdraw. So a subgroup formed to develop a survey, and I should just say that we decided to focus largely on monographs because I believe at the time we said journals are being dealt with already, which after yesterday I realized is quite naive, but we wanted to focus on monographs. But I think many of the takeaways from the survey are largely relevant for serials as well. So we surveyed ARL directors and Oberlin Library directors. We also harassed all of the preservation administrators that we knew, so we got a very high showing from preservation administrators. So we got about 100 responses for the survey, and what we found is that policies are still largely developed within the institution without much consideration for what's happening within their state or their region or their consortia. So there were really only about a quarter of the institutions that even had policies that were looking at what does scarcity mean and how does that come into play in terms of how we make decisions. I mean, I think one of the reasons for that is it's challenging to have the data for that. It's possible for our institution to take scarcity into consideration in decisions, but it's really largely only feasible if we have assistance from a vendor like Sustainable Collection Services, that's what does CLC now. I think one of the other findings is that there's an enormous desire to be able to see what the retention commitments are. 90% of the respondents said that if the information were available, they would look at retention commitments from another institution and how they make decisions about their collection. And 90% in academic libraries is unanimous agreement, basically. So that's huge. So the interesting thing is even though they really wanted to see retention commitments in other institutions, one of the other options was if condition information was available and readily accessible, would you use that? And only 40% of institutions said yes. And I don't know what that means. I don't know if it's sort of difficult for us to consider how we would look at condition information at a collection or large project level in terms of mass withdrawal or retention, like the feasibility of it, or it's just not as important as knowing a copy exists somewhere. We haven't quite parsed out what that means.
So it sounds like, there's again, the intentions, but the reality is kind of another challenge.
That's really interesting information, though. I think
It is.
the idea about we need more information for a library to make decisions about its own holdings. They need more information about the retention commitments of other libraries, and particularly the big repositories. I mean, CRL started aggregating that information by working with the print archiving programs. We've been able to get a lot of information about their program agreements and how long does it, how long do people commit to keeping the print if they're keeping it in that. And it's information that's easy, as I mentioned yesterday, it's easy to come by, but it's very unstructured data. So it's, you got to do a lot of reading to find out what your neighbor is going to keep for the long term, or what that commitment really is. Some archiving programs say they'll, big archiving libraries commit to keeping something for 25 years, but that whole program is reevaluated every 5 years. So it's really not a 25-year archiving commitment, it's a 5-year archiving commitment. Or it's a archiving commitment for 20 years, but a library can withdraw from their commitment but they have to give 90 days notice or something like that. And so that, you get the information that's really going to be meaningful. It's got to be a bit more precise than it is now. And but I think it's good to hear that people would be interested in knowing more about these archive commitments. What about we've been able to get information from the big print archiving program, the other big print archiving programs. We disclose a lot of information about CRL's own archiving commitments. But what about individual libraries' archiving commitments, though? I know Harvard has very good information up on their book depository site about climate control and policies and that kind of thing that apply to the material there. So that's all very obvious. But would institutions like Harvard and Yale and them and even Minnesota be willing to disclose more about, say, the climate control in their off-site storage or the disposal policies for, what they have to go through to deaccession something, that kind of thing?
I can't speak for Harvard, but I can speak for Princeton and for some of our partners in various arrangements. I think there's definitely scope for, exposing more information about what we're doing, what we're committing to as individual institutions. I'll give a couple of examples. I mean, you'll hear in the other panel a bit about our shared print repository and what's called RECAP, and the kind of retention commitments and condition arrangements for materials for long term. But we're also like what's called the Ivy Plus group, which shares their collections via Moderator. We are engaged in a lot of coordinated collection development, and we work out gradually for specific areas, working directly with the subject selectors, MOUs, for commitment to collect and retain within certain subject areas. And a hot topic of conversation right now is, okay, we're doing Brazil, you're doing northern Brazil, and you're responsible for eastern Brazil, and so on. The materials acquired under those agreements, you have a commitment to retain. But where is that commitment reflected? And how, now we have to talk about how to add keystrokes to the catalog record into a shared understanding of which field is going to record that commitment. It doesn't mean we're putting it in a print repository, it means we're committing to retain it, whatever it takes. And so that's an emerging area of interest and concern, like how to make sure, because today's selector retires and somebody else says, well, that's not getting much use, let's get rid of all that southern Brazil stuff. And there went your commitment. So you have to report it, not just in the MOU, but at the item level.
At the item level. And I think that is part of the question about, to what extent that barrier of doing that kind of reporting of commitment, either commitment to retain, and to what extent you might be able to disclose some information about the condition, about the physical condition or the extent of holdings, if you're talking about serials. And when you're talking about monographs, I think even when Hadi's talking about the shared print monograph print retention plan, that will include that commitment to going in and somehow making sure those records are flagged in a way that everybody can tell that this is a retention commitment. I think that's a question, like where it's a resource issue. I think we all feel that that's a good thing, a good intention, but the reality of then having the staff time to add that on to the process, it's more peaceful. So, just.
There's other, aside from the specific formal commitments that libraries make, though, there's other indicators out there about whether some organization is likely to keep something. I mean, their history is one of them. Somebody said yesterday, it may have been Denise, that the corporation stands behind, it's essentially a repository based on the articles of incorporation. And that's pretty good, because, you violate those and you get the Attorney General on your back. Also, Linda Hall Library was interesting to us at CRL because, partly because of all the bricks and mortar assets that they had, big infrastructure for maintaining print, preserving print, and delivering print. They had robust scanning capabilities, document delivery capabilities, but also because they had a $232 million endowment. And that endowment was earmarked for the care and building of these collections at Linda Hall. And so that, that's a signal. I mean, whether Linda Hall says they're going to keep something for 20 years or 25 years or for 5 years or 10 years, that's one thing. But the other thing is, what's behind that? Are there big capital assets that can be drawn upon in the event that the organization comes under financial duress, or that there's big pressures to divest of things coming from other sources.
I'm reminded in this conversation, and I should just say that I can no longer speak for the University of Chicago, where I worked until August, but there are at least two colleagues who are in the room who might be able to. But when we were planning what became Mansueto Library, the on-site storage facility, several of the subject specialists, especially in health sciences, started getting all sorts of phone calls from colleagues because they were planning to deaccession their print volumes, and they said, well, of course you're building this on-site repository. That means you have a commitment to retaining all of your print in perpetuity. And so we struggled long and hard to come up with a statement that we could at least put on the website at that time, and so the subject specialist could point to it, not just seemingly make it up on the fly. And all we felt we could do, and I'm reminded of the comments yesterday to the effect that all politics is local, but local decisions have national consequences. That basically we see no point in time when we wouldn't be keeping these materials, but basically the decision is a University of Chicago decision. So it wasn't anything that we were committing to other than as long as it made sense for us, although we expected that to be for the longue durée, and perhaps that's been revisited since I left. I don't know. The other thing I'd like to say more broadly is that I felt myself struggling yesterday and again this morning when we talk about, in the context of this forum, print retention, print preservation. I mean, I know the focus is on serials and not monographs, but I keep playing myself with, is the safety net about a print copy of everything, even if it's one or more print copies, even things that are digital? Is this the print archive as a safety net against the digital? Or David took us in a very different direction, which is, to me, much cleaner, the retention of things that have not nor are likely to be commercially digitized. So I don't know if as we go on toward an agenda to CRL, if it makes any difference to think in terms of those distinctions for agenda building, but I think they raise very interesting and different problems.
They're very important. Yeah. We'll talk when we have the publishers here. We'll talk when we have the publishers here about the fact that how commercial digitalization factors into the archiving decisions, the archiving commitments. Yeah. One of the other things I wanted to mention was just yesterday morning, I reported to our members, many of you, that CRL's proposal to merge some of our serial titles with Belinda Hall serial titles out there and actually transfer ownership of these. This is a small number of titles to begin with, but it's something, and that will come up to that will be dependent on a vote, an actual referendum by our members. So our 200 and some libraries that are CRL members will say yes or no to that. And it's a kind of things that factor into organizations' retention commitments. There are varying strengths of commitments, as we know.
But that's a safe deaccession, relatively safe deaccession.
It's the only reason we proposed it.
Right.
Yeah. we don't do any unsafe. Jeff?
Hi, Jeff Kosokoff, Duke University. I think David's point about keystroke, this is a keystroke problem in some ways, is something we need to keep track of. I think what's stopping Duke from doing a lot of the recordable, readable, visible commitments is the fact that we think we have to record our metadata in 3 or 4 places. That I feel like we have to go in journal. Now, journal's probably going to feed paper, but is that repeatable? What if we want to do all of our data over again and get it out of there? How's that getting it back into our catalog? And I think we're going to end up putting this stuff in our catalog over and over and over again in different ways. And so what I'd like to see us doing is thinking about core systems like paper and journal, where we record the core retention data only. And that would feed across to other systems like it, into OCLC, back from OCLC to us, and then when we decide to change the way we want to record it in our systems to support workflows, and this will probably be different in different systems, we can wipe it back out and bring it in again, because that data will be there. The idea that we're going to go 583, I can tell you at Duke, we can't even agree at Duke. Is that in the item or the bid or both? And what about the holdings? And it's the stop somebody from reading it problem, but it's also the making it visible problem. We think that might be 3 places we've got to put that for 1 book. And it's unrealistic, I think, to think that we're going to do that now and get it right now, not have to do it again. So I want to figure out a way to divorce that from any local system that has any other job except recording retention.
I would second that. That's a really important concern. I'll just give a 10-second anecdote. When I first entered the profession, I was at Columbia, a South Asian librarian, and I was introduced to a thing in the acquisitions unit called the Cardex. I don't know how many of you are old enough to remember the Cardex. And I remember looking up one of the South Asian journals in there, and it had a rubber stamp thing on it that said PCR. And I couldn't figure out what the heck is a PCR. And I asked around, and it's from the ancient days when there was a primary collecting responsibility for a certain language, and Columbia was responsible to retain. But nobody around still knew what the PCR meant. It was sitting on this Cardex card, and it had no meaning whatsoever at that point. So some sustainable way of recording these things is going to happen.
I guess for us too, it's first a matter of triage and figuring out what are the emergencies in terms of not just retention commitments and saying, okay, benign neglect, we keep it on the shelf, but what do we really need to digitize? Because we don't necessarily have a sense of what's scarcely held in our libraries or what's unique in our libraries. We do to some extent. And the Google Digitization Project has been a wonderful gift to us in that over the years of working with Google, we've identified tens of thousands of titles that were identified for Google because they hadn't been digitized. And now we have all this data about their condition, and we have all of these items that were rejected for the Google project, either by us or by Google, largely for issues of condition such as brittleness. And so we were able to take that data, what's been rejected by Google because it's fragile, and have OCLC help us identify of those titles which ones are not in HathiTrust and either scarcely or uniquely held by us. And that was really amazing because it allowed us to think about risk of loss of content both at the local level, the condition of that item, but also at the national level, here's something that isn't available elsewhere. And so it's given us a place to focus our efforts on digitization and feel really confident about what we're doing. And I would love to live in that space more frequently where I'm able to understand how to triage collection needs both at the local level and at a consortial or a national level. So I think what we need is maybe some help in how do we identify what these titles are, because I think that we could make commitments and do validation for a limited number of titles if we really are thinking about what are the priorities and what are the things that we really need to present to prevent loss of content nationally, not just at the local level.
And do you think seeing that in an aggregated enough collection and being able to then do, and is there that, what is that aggregated, is it OCLC, is it, you know, where and how? And to the point of you don't want to be entering those keystrokes like in 5 different places.
Well, and the other question, I think, is what is scarcity or what is uncommon? Because we haven't quite defined that nationally. And I think it's really important for us to come up with a shared understanding of that before we can really move from discussion to implementation, because once I understand what that means, then I can start to think about, well, what would that mean for my institution in terms of the resources needed for validation of holdings or for digitization. So that would be great.
That's fascinating, though. The whole idea, we talked a little yesterday about the natural kind of affinity between digitization and archiving, retention or preservation. But I hadn't thought of the Google data being useful in triage as well. We thought of it as useful. Metadata that's generated by digitization tells you what you have. But this is a whole other kind of use for that data, figuring out what's fragile enough to have been rejected by the Google or not fed into the Google stream, and what's common enough so that it was already digitized by Google or by somebody else.
It's useful, but it's not all of our collections, because none of our special collections were included in the pick lists, and we have so many materials that were 19th century first editions that went into special collections or small press books that have never been looked at or touched. So
to Mary's point, what Bernie's saying about using this data for multiple purposes. At Illinois, we have at this point essentially we're calling it a waterfall for our digitization efforts. So anything that's rejected by Google for condition or size is essentially being picked up and sent to our IA scanning center immediately. So we're getting it digitized that way because they have more flexibility with respect to size and condition. And if they're rejecting anything because of that, we're flagging those items so that we can go back and begin pulling them locally. But we've already pulled them off the shelves. We've done all that work. It seems silly to go back and do it again 5 years later or 20 years later. The ones that don't make it because of size or condition, even through IA, we're flagging and putting aside only because the volume is still too big to handle with local services. Or because of their size, they're actually cost prohibitive to do through vendors. We piloted one batch and it was off the charts expensive. But that type of flow being set up enables us to hit these things that have already been pulled, and it's identifying a problem area that a lot of us are going to have down the road. Anything that's oversized. Because all of those items are essentially being kicked out because of their expense in being digitized. And they're going to frankly get lost in the shuffle at this point in time.
How much? It's interesting that you're even going a step beyond what the Minnesota people have been doing, identifying the material that gets kicked out by the Google scanning because it's fragile. You're actually then feeding it into a separate stream, so these streams are working in tandem with each other.
Elise County from Indiana. I just wanted to ask you in the second stage of the waterfall where you're sending those things to IA. I mean, I know Google doesn't deselect things that can already be digitized, but is that part of your process? So that the things that Google rejects because of condition, you just have them all and send them to IA? Or do you know that they haven't been digitized elsewhere?
We are checking.
Right,
Sure,
that's
it's
what
not
I'm-
in ID, et cetera.
Or other?
And then going on. And, you know, as I recall, what they have is essentially a barcode scanner that is then going out and getting ADI and IA to pick up whether there's a copy already. It'll pull in the bibliographic information and execute a search on both, and then tell us whether it's been done already.
What are the possibilities of sharing that data more widely? Both, you know, the data that is the kind of things that Google is not doing, for instance, and then also the kind of things that have been identified as fragile or scarce, and are either being fed into other streams or still, you know, kind of sitting on the shelves. Because it seems like that would be actionable information for other libraries to know that. Good way of doing that.
But that gets you back to, I mean, because that's kind of conditioned information, so there has to be, that's more standardized agreement on how we are, where we're putting it and how we're encoding that kind of information. Because, I mean, it is a very good point that people, about how could we better make use of the Google data or the, you know, what we either did or didn't do from Google. But is there a more consistent way we could all flag those decisions and not get into this, I have to have people go into all records, and then those kind of cascade into whether they're in the CLC and the local catalog. And the other point I just want to make is how does then maybe tie into some of these other MOU agreements you have, but they're in a different kind of space, because you may have MOUs that say we're committed to doing something, but that's an agreement among libraries, but how do you tie that information back into the record?
Yeah, it's kind of a handshake. But that's an idea for this that makes the cut for this afternoon. I think that it's the idea of being able to use the metadata generated out of these large-scale scanning operations, and even individual library scan and publisher scanning operations. I mean, that's something we'll talk about in a later one of these sessions. But I want to thank Martha and our panelists, and we'll welcome the next group up to